So you've got a personal journey that I think is inspirational. And it's inspirational because, something happened to your family and you didn't just say, why me, or care about your own family. You did something to help the greater good and really the global population. So tell the story of what happened to your wife and how it relates to what evolved to Tempest.
Yeah, so, I've been in technology for 20 years. We've started a series of tech companies. And they all kind of do the same thing. They aggregate large amounts of data and make sense of it, whether that's local commerce or transportation or media. And 2.5 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I found myself spending a bunch of time in a clinic, as people do. And I was perplexed at how little data had permeated her care. And I would say to people, we're giving more technology to truck drivers to determine which pallet of water bottles to pick up on the way somewhere than we're giving oncologists who are making some of the most life and death decisions you can make. And so it kind of set me down this journey. At the time, we were funding research at maybe a dozen top NCI cancer centers, and I ran around and met with all of them, and then a bunch of private companies, and I just became convinced that the underlying infrastructure that researchers and clinicians rely on was just broken, and broken in the most fundamental ways, and that someone had to fix it. And since we had the resources and the technical talent, if we didn't try, then who was going to?
And so Tempest evolved as a way to interrogate the inner workings of a cancer cell and give information back for the clinician to make decisions. So obviously, we've heard throughout last year at Fortune Health and many other meetings, there are a lot of people trying to sequence cancer DNA. How are you different?
I mean, sequencing DNA, in our case, we sequence both DNA and RNA, but sequencing has become somewhat commoditized because the equipment behind sequencing is so powerful. The real issue is that gathering molecular data is only half the story. If you don't gather clinical data as well, it's like a puzzle with only half the pieces there.
So when you say clinical data, what do you mean exactly?
I mean what's typically referred to as phenotypic, therapeutic, and outcome and response data, which
That's
basically...
a very cool term, by the way.
It is. Which basically means, who is this patient? What drugs are they taking? How are they responding? And what's their molecular composition? Because if you have all that data in one place, you can begin to answer some very basic questions like, why is this drug only working for 60% of people and not the other 40? Who are the other 40? What medication are they also on? What's their age? Are they diabetic? What mutations do they have? What's their RNA expression profile look like? And that's the kind of data that should be flowing freely between not just clinicians and researchers, but also insurance companies, biotech companies. And the whole system is basically broken. As you know, and I've been to now 62 of the 69 NCI cancer centers, and we could go to any one of them and say, tell me how many breast cancer patients you had that were HER2 negative that took Herceptin or an equivalent. Tell me how many did well and how many didn't in the last 2 or 3 years. And they would look at you with a blank stare and then say, I need a grant, I need a postdoc, I need 90 days. I mean, why is that data not at their fingertips? And it's just not.
And so obviously you hit a problem. This is a problem that the vice president talked about last night, which is free access to data, which is collecting data, which is sharing data. And so you come in as this bold entrepreneur, disruptor, and how do you do it?
So I think the public efforts are noble, and I think where the NCI or the NIH is funding research, they should absolutely demand that their data is stored publicly and available publicly. But to clean up this data costs money. And we could debate the amount, but let's call it between $25 and $50 per record. There's 17 million people living with cancer. If you want to track them, let's say you want to track them 3, 4, 5 times a year, you're talking billions of dollars to clean these records. And so there's no committee that's going to sit around and say, here's the answer. It's going to be a private company, likely somebody who builds an economic model or a business model around solving this problem that's going to put eloquent and beautiful technology in the hands of physicians. They're going to demand it. Their patients are going to demand it. And that's how you have these technology paradigm shifts. Beyond that, it's just a bunch of talk. And I think in my case, going through what I went through, my attitude was, we just can't talk any longer. Enough talk. Someone has to actually start fixing this problem.
So talk to me about timescales. So from when you set up this network to collect the samples, to sequence them, to provide a service, to when you're going to start to make discovery upon discovery, so the utility of what you're doing will go up. Are we talking months, years, decades? What's the timescale for discovery here?
So I think we look at it first and foremost as you can't usher in an era of precision medicine without building this fundamental data layer that sits on top of the existing platforms. And those platforms weren't designed to handle this kind of data. They were actually built pre the genome even being sequenced. So you need that data layer. And then once you have that and you're piping in all this real-time data, you have to amass a library of data large enough that you can find those patterns. You know this intimately, the largest data sets today, the Cancer Genome Atlas, Genie, there's a few others, are all in the 15 to 20,000 patient volumes. If you look at, let's take pancreatic cancer, let's look at the Cancer Genome Atlas, also referred to as TCGA. If you look at pancreatic cancer, it's around 160 patients. If I pick any two common mutations, like KRAS and ATM, it's an N of 4, meaning a data set of 4 people. So that doesn't work. You can't have a pattern off 4 people. So we think internally that that library needs to be closer to 500,000 exomes of data clinically annotated. And our goal in the next 3 years is to get to that point.
By the way, I don't know if everyone understands, is when we talk about the Cancer Genome Atlas, the biggest program the government's done to sequence cancer, it's only that. It's none of that clinical annotation you talked about, what drugs, what was the response. All we have is they had cancer. It was kind of a binary function.
Yeah. But take pancreatic cancer, it's amazing. We've been around for 18 months, and we've already amassed close to 1,500 exomes of pancreatic cancer data that are clinically annotated with response data. That's 10 times the size of TCGA's data set. So that's already going to produce a series of patterns that will likely lead to some insight. But it needs to be bigger, and it needs to be federated. So every time we sequence a patient, and every time we clean clinical data, we hold on to a copy of that de-identified data at Tempest. That's our business model. But we give back the clean data to the institution that gave it to us. And the idea is we're like leaving these little farms behind so that they can mine that data themselves and hopefully advance discovery.
That's great. And so what keeps you up at night? I mean, obviously, you're on a track to make discovery, have impact, and help people live longer. What's your worry?
I mean, I don't really, this is our
You've got no worries? Come on.
This is our 6th company, so I don't worry about the things that most people like me would worry about. Typically, you're worried about, like, I need to fund the business, and how am I going to raise capital? So we don't have those worries, and those are really the biggest worries that entrepreneurs typically have. I worry a lot about the pace of migration and how much inertia we can put behind this. Look, you know this. You've forgotten more about healthcare than I'll know, but this is a slow industry, and it's kind of weighted in regulation. It's weighted in the status quo, and if I worry about anything, I worry about how long is it going to take to convince people enough's enough. Everywhere I go, I say to these directors of cancer centers or deans of academic institutions, I'm like, this is not a complicated data problem. There's 3,000 lawns that have to be mowed, and I've got a lawnmower. So we can either talk about the lawns every year, or we can just start mowing lawns. And,
So it's interesting. I mean, I would have taken predicted you answered that question differently. The hard part to me when I look at what you do is, when is something true? So if you do 100 samples and you show something, is that truth enough to actually have some clinician make a decision based on it? Or do you need 500 samples? May it change a little bit? How do you define when it's ready?
Yeah, so there's 2 kinds of truth, right? And this is probably why that doesn't worry me. There's truth in that the pattern is statistically significant, and that is just simply a kind of a mathematical reality. I found 100 patients, 8 of them did X. 8 is either statistically significant or it's not. When we have a finding, we kick that back to the academic institution, to the oncologist, to the researcher. They have to validate that. They have to validate it through the normal course of academic validation. And so we don't have to do that. We don't want to take that on. First of all, it would be horrible for us to take that on. And number 2, there's so many incredible academic institutions that can do that work.
Right, but you're just putting your business model dependent on these academic institutions, which you just told me are dysfunctional, don't know how to manage data, don't know how to do things.
Well, they're dysfunctional in almost every way, but they're really good at writing papers and validating theses. So that's what they do. I mean, so that's the one thing they're great at. And they get rewarded for it. It's how they get tenure. It's how they raise money. So when we have a finding, it's like bait with sharks. If we put something out there and people are jumping on it. So I don't really worry about that. This is a brand new space. The cost of sequencing, as I'm sure people have talked about, has dropped 1 million-fold in roughly 10 or 12 years. And so we now can generate all this data. We're still trying to figure out what does it all mean. And again, because we don't dispense medical care, I don't have to worry a ton about that. I believe fundamentally that if you put data in the hands of good physicians and in the hands of good researchers, amazing things happen. And if you don't put data in front of them, you get what you get. And so we just are focused on just that data problem, not all the things that follow.
So your business model is focused predominantly on the big NCI-designated cancers, the quality care centers in our country. And obviously, any doc or patient can go along this procedure. But is that a bias? I mean, what if you're an individual patient in a small town in Nebraska where your physician has never seen genomics?
Yeah, so we actually are not focused. I spend my time at the NCI cancer centers because part of this new system, when we were building the first big data system in oncology, and as you know, I want it guided by people that have deep insight. And the deepest insight today resides at these institutions. But in terms of the market penetration, we have a sales force that calls on community hospitals, regional hospital systems, national hospital systems, and so that's where the main volume is, right? So the vast majority of patients that are ordering our sequencing or getting our tests or accessing our technology platform are actually not in NCI cancer centers. But trying to figure out what high expression of PD-L1 means and how that's going to relate to immunohistochemistry.
So it's a marker for immunotherapy.
Right, and whether or not you should put your client on a checkpoint inhibitor, most of that science will be done by the people who understand that at depth, and a lot of them reside at big academic institutions.
So as we near the end of the session, what's your dream? So, 2, 3, 4 years from now, what will Tempest do?
I hope that Tempest will become that data layer that sits on top of pathology systems and electronic medical record systems and allows physicians to think and allows researchers to think, having this clean data layer that can usher in precision medicine. So my goal is that most people, starting in oncology, but eventually we'll work our way into neurological disorders, but most people are using this technology as a platform to basically collect data, analyze it, and then do all the amazing things that are coming. You talk about CRISPR or personalized vaccines. All of these things require data, and that system has to be built.
Eric, thank you. It's a privilege, obviously, to talk to you, to work with you, to get someone of your background and new way of thinking about data in our field is really exciting. And I think all of us as physicians and the patients are going to benefit significantly. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.